Today I will talk about the effects of stocking and wetland restoration on Northern Pike, Esox lucius in and around the Baltic Sea and Great Lakes. This is my bachelor thesis and this is the presentation I will hold for my bachelor thesis presentation, and the whole text is available to download in the description. But first, some information about pike. Pike is a common predatory fish in freshwater habitats in the northern hemisphere, in northern Europe, northern Asia, and northern North America. Although it is a freshwater species, it does also appear in the brackish waters of the Baltic Sea, both as anadromous, so spawning in freshwater and living in brackish water, and fully brackish, living and spawning in brackish waters. Pike is cannibalistic species, which cannibalizes on their own at a very young age, at about 5 centimeters long. Pike lives in small populations and is an ambush predator. It has genetic differences between geographically close populations, at least in the Baltic Sea, so it does not interbreed with other population groups of pike, which makes it very genetically adapted to the vegetation surrounding them and their specific habitat. Pike has positive trophic cascade contributions, so that means pike help lowering the density of filamentous algae, aka the effects of eutrophication in the environment it inhabits. And this positive effect is in jeopardy because of overfishing of pike, eutrophication, habitat destruction, and predation from gray seals, great cormorants, and freestyle stickleback in the Baltic Sea, which makes efforts to improve and try to save this positive top-down control that pike has on their environment important. And two methods to increase pike populations is stocking and wetland restoration. Stocking is the release of pike into their natural habitat after rearing them in a pond or alike, and wetland restoration is the restoration of wetlands, and that's important because pike can lay eggs and grow up in those habitats, making them very important for pike populations. Which comes to my research question: how pike populations is affected by stocking and wetland restoration, and how pike populations are affected if wetland restoration and pike stocking declines over time. And this is what I found. I found that there are different types of wetland restoration. There is not only simply restoring a wetland. For example, you can restore for nutrient retention, so the wetland takes up as much nutrients as possible. And this type of restoration has a negative effect on pike populations. In one study read, it decreased the pike abundance by about 70% 2 years after restoration. Other types of wetland restoration is for pike increase, also called pike factories, and this has a positive effect on pike populations. For example, in one study, it went from 3,000 immigrating individuals from the wetland to over 100,000 in just 2 years. And after 5 years, that number was up to 300,000 immigrating pikes. You can also restore for biodiversity, and I've not read any studies that compares the before and after restoration for wetland restoration for biodiversity. But it's very clear in the literature that pike is an opportunistic feeder and can eat almost anything, and an increased biodiversity will help a stable food flow to pike populations, making the pike populations more stable. You can also create artificial wetlands, and this can also work for habitats for pike, since it's shown that artificial wetlands has about the same or a slightly bit higher abundance than a comparable wetland. I also found that it's different on where in the world you restore a wetland and for which pike populations. For example, in Baltic Sea pike, um, specifically anadromous Baltic Sea pike, the effect of wetland restoration might not be that great if the wetland is empty. So if you restore an empty wetland where there is no anadromous pike in the Baltic Sea, it's not very likely that any pike will inhabit it because anadromous pike in the Baltic Sea show extreme natal homing. So they return to the same spawning and mating grounds each year after year. In the study I read, with no exceptions. So that means that if you restore a wetland um, in the Baltic Sea that has no pike, it will probably not be inhabited. On the contrary, in the Great Lakes, pike show no sign of natal homing. So if you restore an empty wetland in the Great Lakes, it will most likely be inhabited by migrating pike, showing the different effects it can have. Also, one thing to mention is that pike does not actually live in wetlands, they only spawn and mate there. So, and there actually has only been one study on whether pike actually increases in the places where pike actually live, and not only uh, becomes more abundant in the wetland where they spawn. And there's actually only been one recent study published about the Baltic Sea coast. It was published in 2023 on how a proximity, uh, if a coastal area has a proximity to a wetland, it has more pike compared to if a coastal area does not have a proximity to a wetland, which proves that wetland restoration can have a great effect on pike abundance. If we then go to stocking, so stocking the release of pike in their natural habitat, it has been going on for a long time in around the Baltic Sea at least. In Sweden, over 300,000 pikes was stocked in our lakes in 1925, being released into lakes all over the country, and that number steadily increased to 52 million pike being released in 1947. Similar events has occurred in Finland and Denmark, who also have released millions of pike in their lakes year after year. But none of this actually worked. None of the releasing of pike improved the pike populations in the lakes. And even modern studies has considered a lot of factors, a lot of aspects, and as decades of research, but they have not found any way to make pike stocking actually work. All these aspects are not considered in all the studies I read. The most common is probably age of the stock pike, where initially you will stock pike fry, because most pike die in this life stage. So trying to enhance the life stage which most pike die will make the most sense in order to restore pike population. But this does generally not work. It has not worked in any published studies. And the most common reason to why it does not work, according to these studies, is cannibalism. So the stock pike are being cannibalized by the bigger wild pike. Uh, and these stock pike are not cannibalized, eaten because they are stock pike. The wild pike does not see a difference. They only see food. But the stock pike has a major fitness disadvantage because they are not genetically adapted to the environment they are being released into. So they are worse adapted to the available vegetation, worse adapted to the currents found in where they're stocked, worse adapted to hunting the specific food in the environment they're being released to, and therefore are worse at hiding from these predators it brings a huge fitness disadvantage. But actually, in when the stock pike grow up, some actually survive, and they survive to what I call a critical bottleneck. So where the relative abundance between the wild and stock pike stabilizes because the stock pike are no longer predated, uh, because they have reached a certain size where they do not get eaten. And this could actually be a bad thing because pike has a very strong local adaptation to the environment it inhabits. So if stocked pike grow up and are able to interbreed with the um, wild pike, it will create a generation that is less adapted to the environment they're being born into than the first generation wild pike, which means that they will take more room in the environment, and they will not be able to live there at a high as a high density as the first generation wild pike. But then if we go back to wetland restoration and try to answer my question, how pike communities is affected by wetland restoration and how they are affected if wetland restoration declines over time. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of different restoration types, and between these restoration types, there are a lot of factors that should be considered. For example, there are a lot of factors that are different between the different restoration types. For example, vegetation uh, in the restoration types, or temperature, different temperatures, the depths of the different restoration types, the shoreline complexity, the number of shallow areas, etc. Um, but uh, restoration can have a positive effect, as I have said. It's also different on where in the world you restore the wetland. So, for example, if you restore in the Baltic Sea, you could have a lower success rate because of the natal homing of the pike, uh, because of predation from gracies, great cormorants, and freestyle thickleback. And in the Great Lakes, it could have a more positive effect because of the no natal homing. If we take the time aspect, so what happens, how are wetland restoration affected if it declines over time? The longest time of the restoration investigation I have read that I have found is 5 years of the restoration, and the pike was um, it was positively influenced by time, but 5 years is a lot shorter than the 100 years of a natural wetland, and a lot can happen in those 95 years. For example, a positive thing that can happen is that biodiversity increases in the wetland. So there's more variety of food, making the environment more stable, so pike can sustainably live there. Negative things that can happen is the reappearance of undesirable plants. So the plants before restoration has appeared once, and they can reappear once again, lowering the pike abundance again because of pike's close adaptation to its surrounding vegetation. And also, eutrophication and global warming can, for example, dry the wetland out, clog the waterways, change the vegetation, etc. There's a lot of things that can happen to a wetland if you do not keep it. But so pike communities can be affected positively by wetland restoration if it's done correctly, and if it declines over time, we don't really know what happens. There's a lot of negative things that can happen if you do not keep up with it. But what I found is that it can also have a positive time can also have a positive effect on wetland restoration. And then if you go back to stocking and try to answer the same question, so stocking does not help pike communities primarily because of cannibalism found in the species. Stocking does also bring genetic risks, which make which would mean that stocking it could actually be positive if we stop stocking pike because of the genetic risks it has. But even though it has been decades, probably even centuries of pike stocking around the Baltic Sea, and even though it does not work, countries keep on stocking pike. So I have consisted a perfect stocking scenario. So if we continue stocking, we could do it in a perfect way at least, with the highest success rate. A perfect stocking should be consistently placed, so year after year it should be consistently placed. It should be placed in a environment where there is no natural recruitment, so basically where there is no present pike that can cannibalize on the released pike. The stocked pike should be released before their ontogenetic shift, so before they start eating fish, start eating each other. The stock pike should originate from large pike parents because large pike parents has a higher hatch success rate compared to other smaller pike, and this would bring the greater success rate of the stock pike to make new eggs and proliferate. The stock pike should also be distributed in several areas, so not all dumped in one place. And the pike that's being released should have a genetic adaptation to the environment they are being released into. So they can be stocked at the highest possible density and has the highest possible survival rate. So they're adapted to the currents, the vegetation, and the available prey that is present in the lake. Something that also should be considered and have not been done in a published study is stocking in brackish waters. Uh, Stocking in brackish waters has probably not been done because most of the stocked pike originate from freshwater communities and are reared in freshwater habitats. And releasing those type of pike in brackish waters will have a low survival rate and low success rate. But it's possible to take pike from brackish populations in the Baltic Sea, rearing them in brackish waters, and then releasing them into brackish coastal areas. Um, this would probably provide more hiding places for the stock pike, um, more food options, and it could also have negative effects like higher predation rates. But if stocking is to continue, we should try something new than only stock in uh, our lakes. What I also propose is a combination of methods, so a combination of stocking and restoration, and not only stocking. Restoring brings new places, new possible places for pike to live in, and stocking would, in my theory, only fill those places. So a combination of the methods would be desirable than only one of them. A combination of stocking and restoration might be the only way to fully restore a anadromous Baltic Sea population because of their imprinting abilities. An empty wetland will not be populated again by anadromous Baltic Sea pike, at least not for a very, very long time. And we do not know how imprinting is done, if it's done genetically or in which life stage. So stocking and restoration could work if imprinting is not done genetically. And if it's done genetically, restoring enormous Baltic Sea pike populations would not be possible. But restoration and stocking could um, decrease the time of restoration for pike communities in other habitats as well. Other things to consider is decreasing the negative effects on pike populations, such as anthropogenic activity, so fishing and the destruction of habitat. Decreasing them will improve pike populations, most likely. Also, lowering the amount of predation from gray seals, great cormorants, and freestyle stickleback will also help improve pike populations around the Baltic Sea. Some conclusions about my studies is that for decades, probably even centuries, in the Baltic Sea at least, we have seen that pike is declining in a lake, and then as a response, we have thrown pike in that lake in order to uh, fix the issue at hand, the decrease of pike. But that is not fixing the problem to why the pike population is declining. That's only compensation for why the pike population is declining. It will not fix the underlying problem. Wetland restoration, on the other hand, could be a way to fix the problem to why pike populations are declining, because a lack of mating and spawning grounds could be a problem, could be the reason to why a pike population is declining. But for example, if the pike population is declining because of predation from gray seals, great cormorants, or freestyle stickleback, then improving mating and spawning grounds will not help restoring pike populations. It would only give the predation species more food to eat from. So what you really need to do when you try to help a pike community is look at a pike community, identify which problem it has, which bottlenecks, why doesn't it grow, and then you try to fix those problems and those bottlenecks, and not try to find a one fix all method, because pike communities is most likely not suffering from only one bottleneck, and it cannot the same bottleneck, and cannot be fixed with a one fix all method um, for pike populations. I want to thank you for listening. I hope you learned something, and goodbye.